Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex, society, and culture.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Today we're doing a special episode where we focus on one topic, the allegations of sexual assault leveled against Ron Jeremy by women both inside and outside of the adult industry. We'll be interviewing cam model Ginger Banks and journalist EJ Dickson, but first, some background.
While we can't systematically review all the allegations against Jeremy, a brief look at the story of one prominent performer, Ginger Lynn, is emblematic of our shifting cultural landscape around sexual assault, especially within the adult industry.
Lynn claims that Jeremy raped her in the shower after filming together in Hawaii in 1983. She says she shared her story with a few people in the industry, including a Hustler interviewer, but no one wanted to talk about it. Decades later, Lynn became the host of her own radio show, and in 2003, she revisited the allegations on air. This sparked some internal discussion in industry publications and web forums. But it wasn't until the past few months that Lynn's allegations, as well as those of numerous other women, began to garner mainstream media attention. In today's episode, we want to explore what's changed in the industry and in society writ large so that these allegations are finally getting attention.
Importantly, we see the stakes of this story as being much bigger than Jeremy's reputation. We are focusing on this story because it speaks to a much broader question of whose allegations of sexual assault are believed or even heard. In many ways, Jeremy is a dinosaur representing the norms of a different time. Responding to Lynn's allegations in a 2003 interview with AVN, he says, "I went up to the room with her to take a shower, and then we messed around. No goodbye, no get lost. We were very good friends. How can you rape a friend?" It's literally as though he's never heard of the concept of date rape. In fact, according to the Bureau of Justice statistics, 78% of rape and sexual assault cases occur between two people who know one another. Even if Jeremy's attitudes are stuck in the 1970s, social norms have certainly shifted for the rest of society. This is one reason old accusations may be getting more serious attention.
Also, independent, self-directed cam models and clip producers make up the fastest-growing segment of the porn industry. These performers are less beholden to studios and other industry middlemen to reach clients, and they cultivate large social media presences that they can also use to push for change in the industry. I was so impressed by the power of this collective media organizing that I actually wrote a short piece for Cybergology on how these events unfolded called Ron Jeremy, Exxxotica, and Twitter as a Form of Resistance.
In particular, a cam model named Miss Lollipop, who also goes by Lacey, sparked a conversation about Jeremy and consent more broadly when, in October of 2016, she tweeted, "At my first adult con, posing for a photo with Ron Jeremy, he slips his finger under my panties and into my vagina. Hashtag not okay." We spoke to Miss Lollipop, who, while she declined to be interviewed for the podcast, provided us with a statement. She said,
I originally made this tweet as a warning to other cam girls and adult performers to avoid him at cons, especially newbies who might not know his reputation. I remember being shocked as I got so many responses saying, "This happened to me too," and realizing that this was not an isolated incident at all, but that he is an absolute predator. I went through a little bit of guilt at the time for not using my voice earlier. I'm very grateful Ginger Banks and others picked up on this and would not let it go. As it became more public recently, I started getting a lot of comments that wanted to pick apart my motivations, blame me, ask me why I didn't report it sooner, etc., and a lot of well-intended advice about what I or we should be doing to go after Ron. Things like, "Why aren't you unionized? You should be starting a group. You should be filing suit. You should contact the press." A lot of you shoulds, like somehow because I raised my voice, it was all my responsibility to make sure that this predator was removed. This is not something I wanted to become a crusader for. My intention was never to go after him. My intention was to make what happened as public as possible so that others would be able to avoid him. As a result of all that's happened, I feel like my goal of warning others has been accomplished.
Jesse and I also have some personal investment in this story. We attended the 2017 Exxxotica Expo in Chicago, the event that precipitated an avalanche of allegations. To our knowledge, Jeremy has not been accused of sexual misconduct at this particular event. However, several models spoke out on Twitter about unwanted touching by fans, and one prominent model, Vera Sky, left the event for this reason. It was at this point that cam model Ginger Banks began compiling a list of allegations against Jeremy, arguing that the presence of a, quote, known groper, end quote, at the event was symbolic of the Expo's lack of concern for model safety and consent.
We'll now turn to our interview with Banks, followed by an interview with EJ Dickson, who we mentioned at the beginning of our story.
Ginger Banks has been working as a cam model and clip producer for over 7 years. She produced a video and helped lead a conversation on Twitter about the sexual assault allegations against Ron Jeremy. Ginger, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to talk to you guys, too.
So, I know Ron Jeremy hosted the MV Awards in 2017 and that he shows up to many of the expos that cam models attend, but what made you decide to sort of start paying attention to him and eventually speak out about some of the allegations surrounding his behavior?
One of my life goals is I want to help end the stigma surrounding this industry. And if we have one of the biggest names out there representing us to the mainstream going around sexually assaulting people, I don't think that helps with the stigma surrounding our industry. It almost seems like so many people inside and outside of the industry had heard about this. And it almost was kind of like they thought, oh, that's just how porn is.
Yeah.
It was easier for them to just blame porn than it is to actually think, okay, why do people sexually assault other people?
Right.
Like, oh, it's just porn. They accept it. He's the face of the industry. He hosted the XBiz Award not that long ago.
Right.
And so it was really important to you to say that consent still matters in the adult industry?
Of course it does. And consent should matter no matter what industry you go into. And if porn should be considered a job, which it is, they should have all the same stringent rules and regulations that other jobs have, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't have any less rights to our body just because we're porn stars or sex workers.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that you said in the video that you put out about this is that you started it off saying that there's been allegations against him, both from inside of the industry and outside of the industry, and that you talked about why it bothers you that you have to say that, but you do have to say that. So do you want to talk a little bit about why you felt it was necessary to say that?
I thought it was important to bring up because I do see that society puts more validity on the claims of people who are outside of the industry, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So I did realize that was important to bring up, but it did hurt me to have to say that because it shouldn't be that way. A sex worker's testimony should be just as valid as a person outside of the industry.
Yeah.
Can you maybe give us just like a little bit of a timeline just to kind of like piece together the story for people of how this conversation really picked up?
I consider myself a member of the sex worker community. So I follow a lot of fellow sex workers on Twitter and interact with them. And a webcam model that I really respect and I talk with a lot was saying how she was sick of seeing Ron Jeremy being treated like a king within our industry and how he had violated her at one of the expos. And that was the first time I had ever heard of anything like that. And I just started reading all of these things and I was pretty blown away at how common it was.
Are you talking about Lacey or?
Yes, Miss Lollipop.
Okay.
And that's kind of just what got me to hear about Ron Jeremy in the first place. And then once I started realizing that these allegations were coming from lots of different women, like it seemed like it was a pretty big problem and he shouldn't be someone representing us. I was like, all right, if I ever see him, he's working an event or something, maybe I'll talk about it on Twitter. I'll say something like that because social media is powerful. Depending on how you use it. ManyVids had already worked with him in the past. And once Miss Lollipop had said that, I sent them a tweet and a direct message and I said, are you aware of this? And they were not aware of it. Honestly, a lot of the mistakes ManyVids makes can be attributed to their lack of education.
Yeah.
As soon as you educate them, they're very receptive to the knowledge you present them. A lot of the time, they're definitely not perfect to their business.
Sure, right.
But that's good to
hear.
So
compared to the way that Exxxotica responded, I was a little hesitant because Exxxotica had only said he is not booked to appear yet for the Denver Exxxotica Expo.
Right.
So ManyVids said, we'll never work with him again. Exxxotica's response was a little more hesitant. So
yeah,
I kind of had a feeling that they weren't going to distance themselves from Ron Jeremy at any point. I had already read the Reddit AMA that the owner of Exxxotica had online, and he was talking about how cool Ron Jeremy was and stuff like that. So I knew he was kind of friends with him in a way, or at least looked up to him.
Yeah, we saw that. We saw that at the time on your Twitter, and we're pretty struck by the way that Exxxotica was using his fame to kind of promote its own event without
acknowledgement
any
of the accusations.
Acknowledgement of that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't just that. I mean, that was problematic in and of itself, but it also seemed that the owner of Exxxotica, Jay Handy, I believe is his name, was kind of normalizing that behavior and suggesting, hey, that's what we do here at Expos. We go and grope random models, and actually, you never know, maybe one of them will sleep with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was definitely alluding to certain things to try and get more people to come to the expo, which I thought was kind of a dangerous thing to say. Like, it's up to every single person how far they want this picture to go, how far they want this fan interaction to go. Some girls don't want to be touched by their fans, and that's perfectly fine for them.
Right.
Some girls allow their fans to put their faces in between their butt cheeks, and that is totally fine too. It should be up to the performer, but we need to explain that to the fans before they get there. It shouldn't be, quote unquote, put your fucking hands on them, don't be a pussy, which is what he said.
Wow, is that actually what he said?
Yeah, it was in regards to a picture of a fan with a porn star, and the fan didn't have his hand on the person all the way.
Yeah.
It's just the encouragement of toxic masculinity, and it's unfortunate to see it. Once you recognize it and then you start to see it everywhere, you're like, shit, this is everywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, exactly. And I mean, you could promote a culture of consent at these events and still have it be a very sex positive space with, these kinds of fan interactions and stuff, but that kind of toxic masculinity, that kind of rape culture, using that to sell the event just seems like really dangerous.
Yes, exactly. That's like profiting off of really terrible things, because I personally have been sexually assaulted at these expos by the fans, and I know it happens to a lot of other people. And seeing it happen, seeing the accounts of people happening in Chicago is what got me to finally show everybody what that guy was saying on Reddit.
Yeah, we were at the Chicago Exxxotica when all of that was going down. And that was really interesting because it was so prevalent. And we saw a lot of people, both on Twitter, but also just being there, who left and said they weren't going to participate in it
We know
anymore.
At least one prominent cam model very publicly stated that she was leaving the event because there was groping and she felt uncomfortable and unsafe in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the way that I handle the expos now is that if I'm dressed provocatively, I don't walk by myself anymore. I don't feel comfortable walking by myself at all. My Free Cams does provide security, so if I ever needed a security guard to walk me to the bathrooms or something like that, I could have them there, which is amazing.
Right.
But I really feel like it shouldn't have to be that way, Like, I shouldn't have to have a security guard to walk me 100 feet. Fans should know that they shouldn't touch you without your consent.
Right.
We have a perfect opportunity to teach thousands of people who walk in the doors of these expos what consent means. Like, it is not just black and white. People are just like, oh, what, you don't understand? Like, no, some people don't understand, and maybe we should teach it. Our natural animal instincts are to fuck each other. Let's be elevated human beings.
Yeah, because you think that there could be a way that those expos could serve as educational platforms too, where when people come in, they could even just have somebody at the front that's trained to say, hey, some people will let you, take pictures with them and touch them, and other people won't. This is how you need to approach the models that you want to talk to.
Did you see any signs at the Chicago Expo talking about consent? Because
no, not a single one.
I feel like we had brought it up before that expo. I remember specifically Miss Lollipop posting signs from a
Star Trek convention. I saw that too.
Yeah, or Star Trek or something.
Yeah.
And it was like, wow, this seems so simple and probably doesn't cost them that much money, and it's going to make them look even better. Like, public relations, hello.
There's a lot we can learn from Star Trek.
But no, they would rather stand by Ron Jeremy, and then the owner tried to go to one of my Reddit posts where I was kind of alluding to the fact that I might be fucking a fan at one of the expos. And then in the comments, I'm called out. They're like, that's your boyfriend's shirt. And I'm like, oh yeah, you guys. And that's a fantasy that I decided I wanted to provide to my fans. You can't speak for me. Say that.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that actually was one of the biggest things that soured me on Exxxotica, was the way that the owner of Exxxotica, rather than than speaking to, I think, the very valid arguments that you were making, tried to undermine your credibility by saying, oh, but look, you have sex with people at these events, and therefore, like, like it was this weird...
The old tradition of like trying to slut shame the witness. Like,
yeah, exactly. And like using that whore stigma to undermine your credibility while simultaneously like building an industry and capitalizing on sex work. To me, that was just really outrageous.
Problematic.
Yeah, I could not believe the things I was reading that were coming out of his mouth, like insulting adult entertainers' relationships, saying we can't have successful relationships, insinuating I've made bad life decisions to get to the point where I am in my life or being a sex worker. It's just, but all the while profiting off of us. Like, he would say things like, well, I'm not the one doing it.
Yeah.
He should have just said, well, I'm just a pimp. Would have sounded pretty much exactly what he's saying.
Or like, I actually couldn't do it. Nobody would.
Yeah, right? I mean, that would be more of a compliment. I couldn't do it. It's a hard job. I wish he would have said that.
Yeah.
I mean, when I heard one of my website owners say how he would not care if his daughter became a webcam model, he would support her in all of these things, that warmed my heart. That made me proud to work for that company. So I'm going to try to get to know the owners of these things as much as I can and see, do they really support us, or are they trying to make money off of us? And unfortunately, it seems to be the latter for most of these companies. So I'm going to try and stick with the ones that I think are going to listen to me and take my input, because I think that's how I can make the biggest difference.
Yeah, I actually think that the work that you did here made a huge difference. And we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that, and maybe about the way in which like the decentralization of pornography maybe allowed for this sort of, Twitter uprising that did change the policies, at least in many vids.
Yeah, I mean, in your video, you said that, quote, we have more power now as performers than we ever have before. And I thought that was like a really poignant statement.
Yeah, we do. I mean, I feel like before it's, all right, we work for companies like porn companies, you go to a set, there's a person in charge, that owns this company. Now, the fact that we're independent contractors is so much like stronger. It's so much, we have huge platforms with our social media, and one director or one company can't really fuck with your career anymore if you rub someone the wrong way.
Yeah.
And so it's up to us to use these things for good. I really do feel like a sense of responsibility with the number of people who see my tweets each month. Like 1 million people have viewed my profile in the last month. Am I going to be talking about hate? Or like good things? Like, it's totally up to you. And in the past, this didn't exist. So this is like a brand new frontier that we're all viewing right now. It's awesome, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really awesome too. And this keeps coming up again and again in the different people that I talk to. There seems to be within the sex worker community right now such a social justice orientation and this sort of a activist streak that I think is really important for changing attitudes about the industry, but also about women in the culture at large.
Yeah. I mean, how can we ask for like equality or people not to discriminate against sex workers, but not also fight for the rights of minorities? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's like, oh, I'm only going to speak up when discrimination affects me. That's not how you make the world a better place.
Right. Yeah. And the fact that as sex workers, so many people have such large platforms now, like yourself, but there's so many of them that there is a space for that now, for that sort of grassroots, like organizing and activism.
There is, to the degree that these platforms allow those allow those accounts to exist. And I mean, at this very moment, I think at least on Twitter and to some degree in other spaces, that's true. But on the other hand, it still feels very tenuous, and the ability of these platforms to just change their policies overnight and silence like sex workers' voices in the process, I think is really concerning as well. And I mean, of course, that's what we're seeing with Patreon right now. And, and we've seen it with Tumblr in the past and probably other platforms in the future.
I'm really interested to see like if Twitter's terms of service ever really drastically change. I think that might be like the one social media avenue that there would be a huge backlash if that happened. I think a huge part of Twitter is porn. I don't think Twitter would ever admit that to the general public, but I get a lot of interactions on my profile. I don't really know. I need to compare them to some mainstream numbers, I guess, but I don't know. Twitter's definitely always been the friendliest towards adult entertainment and sex work, it seems like. So I really hope they never decide to go against that. I mean, they have with Vine and Periscope, and they own both of those companies. So who's to say that they wouldn't? But it is unfortunate that like we can just have the rug ripped out from underneath us. That's how it feels when this stuff happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking to Melody Cush once, and she described the like prospect of the Twitter TOS changing as the pornpocalypse.
Honestly, though, it would be so bad. Like,
I mean, that's terrible, but that's a good phrase.
Like, Vine hadn't been around that long when they changed their terms of service, and it still took me like over 8 hours to go through and delete all of my adult content related stuff, because they put your account on pause and then they let you do that and then they let it bring it back. If they implemented anything like that for Twitter, that would literally be impossible for a lot of us to do. Like, I don't know what I would do. That would take days and days of time to even try to do something like that. So, I mean, I pray nothing like that ever happens. All I have to do is make as many connections as I can, people who would also think that it was unjust or unfair if Twitter did something like that, and they would feel like speaking up about it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do that in the world as my whole life. That's going to be my goal.
Yeah, well, that's a good life goal.
Networking is so important. PR, public relations, the way we're viewed, like all of that, it's a battle, and I want to win it.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that.
And I think education is the answer. I don't know how you educate people, but like, I think I'm just going to try and use Pornhub like a YouTube. Because I know YouTube might like take my stuff down or like age restrict it, but a lot of people will watch Pornhub too.
You know what I didn't ask? Did you end up going to the Denver Exxxotica?
I did end up going to the Denver Exxxotica Expo, and in the past, I promoted the hell out of me going, but as soon as I found out that Ron Jeremy was like doing a panel, I still went. I had all my stuff booked, but I didn't really like promote it as much as I normally would have, because I didn't, like I said, when you go to these things, you're selling them tickets. So I didn't want to be giving money to those people, but I also didn't want to waste my money, and I wanted to have a trip to Denver. So
sure thing. Yeah.
You got to look out for yourself too. Yeah. One of the things that we thought was really striking about the Chicago one is that he crashed other cam girls' panel.
It was also like porn stars, but it was like how to get into the biz. And there were 3 women, like either cam models
Oh, gosh, of course.
Yeah, and he wasn't on the panel, and he walked in, 15 minutes into it and then took it over.
Yeah.
That is so disrespectful.
Yeah, I mean, even before we saw all of the allegations unfold, we were sitting in this panel, and he walked in, and we like look at each other and was like, this is a mess. Like, why are they letting him do this? And then it became a bigger mess and a bigger mess.
Yeah.
I think I just probably like, it's Ron Jeremy. You don't want to tell him to stop. Oh, no. When have we heard that before? Don't want to tell him no.
Yeah, I mean, that was
weird.
just a little micro example of the very huge problem that there is.
Like, even some of these allegations, like, not even just Ron Jeremy, so many of them, I've heard of stuff happening to girls, and then they're like, well, shit, I still need a picture for my social media.
Yeah, and that's how he gets away with so much of
much?
that. Yeah, that there's like a knowledge on the part of the women who are working in the industry that it would be disadvantageous to them to come out with these stories, or to not take the sort of opportunities that they have to take in order to further their career. And that's the conversation that people need to be having too.
Right. People don't want to be blacklisted. It's not just about that one shoot or whatever, but it's about people get the sense that, you're not
you're going to try. Are you trying to take us down or something? We don't want to work with her. Is she going to accuse us of rape? Like, that's like the attitude that people have now. That's not what's happening here. And
I mean, that's my fear though. Exactly what you're talking about with the attention that Me Too has gotten now too, is that it's so important for women to speak out about their experience, but it ends up being used against them as well in workplaces where now you do have exactly what you're talking about. Men who are like, oh, I don't want to work with this person because she
like,
might
I don't even know how
me.
to interact with her as a person now. Like, that makes no sense. Like, that's what it seems like a lot of people are saying that, like, oh, I don't know how to flirt. Like, maybe that is why we need to talk about consent. Like, I think a lot of people really genuinely don't understand how it works.
Yeah.
Or they do and they choose not to learn.
Yeah,
they don't want to learn that they've been like making people uncomfortable or any of those things.
And I think that that's right, that there's this like bizarre, almost moral panic in reaction to all of these allegations in the Me Too campaign, where men are actually like pushing this, I think, false, but pretense of like sex negativity, rather than being like, oh, okay, well, we should learn how to interact well and contextually. They're like, oh no, I guess I can't flirt with anybody ever. I can't hug anybody ever.
It's absurd. Yeah, it's like they're going to the other side of like, actually, I feel like they're not even trying to use any logic in their argument, and it's unfortunate. It seems like it's reactionary. What is the word for it? It's like,
I think it is reactionary.
It takes time and it's hard. Like, it's hard to solve solutions the right way. Let's just do it the easy way.
And it's hard to look at your own behavior. And that's the problem, too. That it's easier to just be like, oh, these women are crazy. We don't want to be in a room with them because we might get in trouble.
Or it's like, maybe they have some valid concerns. The world needs to change. I really think it is. Like, a lot of the reason that it's stayed the same, I think, is just been people not talking about stuff. And just for so long, I think people accepted sexual assault in so many different forms, like from their boss, family members, and just like talking about it now, you're like, oh, that's how we learned that this is not okay.
Yeah.
That's the first step. And we're doing it right now, I think.
Yeah.
It's really important.
It is. And I've never seen anything like this sort of public conversation about sexual assault and harassment. And I think that it's really important.
Awesome. Well, it was great talking with you.
Yeah, it was nice to talk to you too, Ginger. Thank you. EJ Dickson is a writer and editor who was born and raised in New York City. She is currently the deputy digital editor at Men's Health. She was previously a tech staff writer and lifestyle editor at the Daily Dot, as well as a sex and dating editor at Mike. You can follow EJ on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at EJ Dickson. Okay, so welcome. Thanks so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we brought you on to talk today about your recent article in Rolling Stone about the sexual assault allegations leveled against Ron Jeremy. Tell us a little bit about the article and what prompted you to write it first.
Sure. I've been covering the industry for a few years, and I remember when the whole James Dean allegation surfaced, I'd heard a lot of things about Ron Jeremy, and, just informally. So I started looking into them, and it ultimately didn't coalesce into a piece that people didn't feel comfortable going on the record.
Right.
But after I saw the tweet saying that Ron Jeremy had been banned from the Exxxotica Expo, I think it was the New Jersey Expo this year, it became clear to me that the whispers that I had heard in the past, that there was probably a little more weight to them, and I started looking into it. That was post-Weinstein, that was post-Stacey, I think, and people felt more comfortable going on the record about this type of thing. With this kind of a piece, you don't really commit to it unless you see if there's any weight behind it.
Right.
Just because it's such a serious allegation.
It sounds like this piece actually is part of the so-called Weinstein effect then. I didn't realize that you started to pursue this as part of these allegations that were coming out more broadly in other aspects of society.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think it definitely made it easier for me to talk to people. I think that's a fair assessment because, the Weinstein effect to me is less, oh, who's the next famous man that can be brought down, and more women feel emboldened to tell their stories and to come forward and to actually attach their names to their stories, which is amazing and is not something that I've ever seen before. But this is something that I had been aware of prior to allegations coming out about other prominent men, and it was something that I was interested in covering before. So it was really when I saw that Exxxotica tweet that I was like, okay, well, I think that something is probably coming together now, and that these women feel safe enough to come forward.
Yeah, so was your experience this time around was it a lot easier for you to get people to talk about it?
Yes, infinitely easier.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So tell us a little bit about what happened.
So basically, according to my reporting, Ron Jeremy has been dogged by sexual misconduct allegations generally for decades. These allegations, there have been complaints to law enforcement officials, but they haven't really progressed further for various reasons because the prosecutor didn't find any evidence. But there have been informal allegations percolating for years and years among a lot of women in the industry. It's sort of hear about this whisper network in various industries, and that seems in porn. If you were enmeshed in this whisper network, it was generally known that this is somebody you didn't want to go near.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things that you said that was really interesting in the article is you talked about the fact that Ron Jeremy kind of stands in as an everyman, as a man that's not particularly attractive or, charming, and that sort of identification with him on the part of other kind of ordinary men probably kept him somewhat safe. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I thought that was a really interesting point.
Sure. I think that's true to a degree. I think Nina Hartley said that, and Nina has known Ron very well. I think that's partially true. I think that men are more inclined to identify with him precisely because he is this everyman. He's kind of this Jewish guy from Queens who, improbably becomes this porn star and has sex with thousands of women. That's definitely part of his appeal. But I think the larger part of what protected him for so long against these allegations, I think it was a few things. I think starters, it was the fact that he is one of a very small handful of people in the adult industry who have sort of made this quote-unquote crossover. He has enormous mainstream recognition. And that's a really valuable thing. That has cachet if you're in, the industry, which sort of exists on the fringes. And I think the other aspect of this is a guy who, he said as much in the article, in his statement to us. He said, I'm a groper. This is what I do. He's kind of been playing this off for years as sort of this ironic, like, oh, we're having fun. Like, you're in on the joke, I'm in on the joke kind of thing. And what became clear from the women I spoke to who alleged sexual assault against him is that they weren't in on the joke. They didn't consent to it. But that sort of ironic persona is kind of what blanketed him and shielded him from this for so long.
Yeah, and I think actually that points to a broader issue that would be great to talk about. There's a reluctance to accept or believe women in the industry, I guess for multiple reasons, both that adult performers are taken to be less credible, but also it's assumed that being sexual is their job, and therefore, according to some people, consent isn't an issue, or just by being in the industry, they are consenting to this kind of behavior. And it seems like Ron Jeremy falls back on those kinds of assumptions to shield himself from any sort of accountability for his actions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on. And you were asking me before why I wanted to write this article. And I think more than anything else, honestly, it was that.
Yeah.
It was the fact that they're even in the midst of this giant, all-encompassing movement where women are feeling comfortable enough to come forward. There is this subsection of women who are treated like second-class citizens for no reason other than the fact that they accept money for sex. And that has always enraged me. That has always driven me to do the work that I do. And because you're right, like no one cares. They assume that because you agree to have sex for money, that people can treat you however they want to. And that's just not the case. Consent still exists.
Right. Yeah, that's actually something that's kind of ironic to me, that I have a hard time wrapping my head around the logic of that at all, given that if you are somebody who accepts money for sex, that's all very contractual. So I'm not actually sure why things that are outside of that contract would then be seen as up for grabs for anyone at any time.
Exactly. Yeah. Somebody I spoke to, I don't think this made it in the article, but somebody I spoke to told me, if you gave me money to build a house and then I built your house, you wouldn't say, oh, go build my garage and not pay them. You know, you shouldn't expect when you enter into a contract with something that encompasses every form of labor under, I think I related that metaphor a little awkwardly.
Yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying, though, because that's my impulse, too, is to say none of that makes any sense. Like, why would you approach sex workers and overlay so much sexuality on them that you're unable to see them outside of that? Because I think that that's what underlies a lot of these assumptions is, well, the women who engage in sex work of any kind, and in this case, people who are in pornography, but I think this is more broad than that, then have no right to deny sexual advances, or when they come forward and say that was against my will, those get brushed off as, oh, well, you're here already and you're in this industry and you signed up to be in this shoot. So whatever happens here is fair game.
Yeah, I mean, no one takes it seriously.
Right.
What it really comes down to is how our culture views sex and how, we view it through this lens of something that it's to be ashamed of or something that we should chastise women for. So it's really, really hard for us to come to terms with the fact that sex work is a form of labor that's just as legitimate as any other.
Exactly.
And that these, like any other laborer in any other industry, these women should be protected and have the same rights.
Right. And I mean, I think this is an important conversation, and sex work and the rights of sex work is definitely a major theme of our podcast. But I think if I could broaden the conversation a little bit too, it's not just sex workers that are making these allegations against Ron Jeremy. And actually, Ginger Banks makes this point as well in her video. It's also women who show up to the expos as fans. The question then is, beyond just sex workers, and I think we've made some really important points, but all women who, by entering these spaces, are expressing some sort of sexual agency also seem to be implicated in this kind of denial of the right to consent.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I'm working on a follow-up story right now, and I don't want to get too much into that, but that was definitely a theme that came up persistently.
Yeah.
And I also think it's important to note that this is where his status as sort of this desexualized, almost innocuous, like the guy on The Surreal Life, like this is the guy who's in all those music videos.
Right.
I think that's where that really plays a role because, if you cross over in the mainstream, you have access to an even larger group of women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of women, when engaging with him, sort of saw him as this, for lack of a better word, teddy bear.
Mm-hmm.
Than anybody who could pose a sexual threat, which, makes sense to me. Like, I don't go to expos, and if I met a porn star, I obviously wouldn't assume that they would be a sexual threat. But my impression that I get in talking to these women is that he used his mainstream status as a way to disarm them, I guess.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's I think a good way of putting it. I also think, getting back to an earlier point that you made, is that still, even if he's not shooting, he is doing signings and drawing people to, these various expos and events across the country. And I think that one of the important things to think about is that there are still a lot of men who are running these different, whether it's Exxxotica or other expos, who know that Ron Jeremy will bring crowds and thus have a vested interest in him maintaining that sort of teddy bear crossover status that we've kind of talked about earlier. That there's, there is a vested interest by a lot of people in power in the industry to not let these allegations sort of diminish his status.
Yeah, I think that's true. I can't speak to that to a large degree because you guys would probably know better than I would about the financial aspect of like how these expos are run. But at the same time, I do think that there has been a lot of positive change from the expos and these big industry events and a demonstration that they're not going to stand for it anymore, which I think is good.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, particularly like platforms like MiniVids came out and said, oh, well, we won't use him anymore or work with him anymore, and really took the voices of the women in the industry very seriously.
Immediately, yeah. Didn't even think twice about it. They that statement immediately. And, we keep coming back to Weinstein, but I feel like it's important to mention that that was pre-Weinstein, that was pre-Me Too, that was pre this conversation about believing all women. So, I think they should be really commended for that. I mean, it's not insignificant that the main person who brought this to people's attention was a cam performer.
Right.
And it's not insignificant that the social media movement against him was largely led by cam performers.
Yeah. On Twitter, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who 10 years ago would not traditionally have been considered like industry power players.
Not at all.
But yeah, they do have a lot of autonomy, and they are increasingly gaining tremendous power. And I mean, Julia Ann sort of made that point in the context of, like, we have to give credit where credit is due. Like, yes, there are like big names coming forward, but you have to give credit to the smaller names. But I mean, they're definitely like, they're big names in themselves.
Right, yeah.
And I don't think that these allegations and this movement would have gotten traction within the industry had it not been for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. So are there any other key talking points about the article that we should dive into, do you think?
I could talk about this for like hours.
So can we, but I want to make sure we respect your time.
I guess what I would say, and I get really impassioned talking about this, so I apologize if it came off as like super strident earlier, but I guess what I would say is to just think about it in the context of this larger movement and who's being listened to and who's not. That's been my major takeaway from reporting this out, is that we're living in a really exceptional time right now. It's the first time I can think of where women are being believed, but there's a hierarchy inherent to that, and there's a hierarchy of women whose stories are believed. There are people at the top and there are people at the bottom.
Right.
And I think that such a huge part of the story has to do with the fact that the women making these allegations were at the bottom of that hierarchy. Even now that they're out, it continues to be the case today. I saw, the comments on Facebook. I looked at the comments, which I never do for any of my stories, but I did now. It's stupid. But top comment was like, who's surprised? Who cares? Like, these women invited that just by being in the industry. They should have expected that being next to Ron Jeremy. I am a woman. I am tangentially involved with the industry as someone who covers it. I would never expect that treatment in a million years from anyone, and regardless of their reputation. And no woman should.
Right.
So that attitude is outrageous to me and is totally irrelevant to the conversation. And it's just something that I think really needs to be considered when we're having this larger conversation about sexual assault and sexual harassment in general.
Right. I agree. It's totally outrageous. And I think that the point that you're making about people at the bottom of this hierarchy getting listened to is really important, because we suddenly have this major dynamic shift where not only are women being listened to, but women who, don't have status outside of the adult industry. And that's a pretty remarkable thing. I think even the Me Too movement that came after all of the Weinstein allegations was totally striking, and the way that people related to it was striking, because I'd actually never seen that much solidarity.
Yeah, me neither.
And open conversation about things that people are usually very hush-hush about, and not just people, women who are taught to silence anything that's negative, particularly against people of power. Yeah, I think it's pretty amazing what is happening right now. And I think it does mark a huge cultural shift that we ought to be paying attention to.
Yeah,
it does.
It does, but I still think it's an open question as to whether sex workers are going to be included in that solidarity.
Yeah. Sex workers often get thrown under the bus. We'll see how this plays out and whether sex workers are still continued to be a positive part of the conversation, or if they get brushed aside.
Yeah, or if the default for sex workers will always be victim blaming. And outside of this one high-profile person who has been in the industry for 40 years and who's amassed 40 years worth of stories and allegations, if other situations with more active performers or less high-profile people, if sex workers are going to be taken as seriously.
I would hope so. I really would, and I think about this a lot. But my instinct, just from covering this for so long, and seeing the responses to my stories for a few years, is no. And I hate to say that, but I mean, even look at the fact that I wrote this. That shouldn't. I'm not a sex worker. This is not my story to tell. The fact that a non-sex worker had to write this story for a mainstream publication for anyone to take the slightest bit of notice is a problem.
I think that's right.
It's one that I grappled with, and the response to it too, it also led me to grapple with it, and it made me think, is this movement really worthwhile if the people whose stories we should really be listening to, who haven't been listened to, if they're going to be left behind.
Yeah.
And I am concerned about that. There's so much work that needs to be done to erase these preconceptions we have about victims and women in general, women who do sex work, women who are rape victims and are in, relationships with their abusers. And these scripts can't be undone in a few months in this short amount of time. And I worry that we're not talking about them enough and that we're not doing that work, if that makes any sense. I think we're kind of, as a culture, losing our focus a little bit.
Yeah.
If that makes sense at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if I can make a broader point or maybe answer my own question in a different way, but kind of to push forward this conversation, it's my feeling that so long as we allow victim blaming to persist in certain aspects of society, that ultimately everybody is put at risk by that, right?
Yes.
That our rejection of this victim blaming has to be wholesale, or else we're all going to suffer and we're all going to potentially be victim blamed. And so, my belief is that when it comes to sex workers and sort of the stigma and the tendency to not believe sex workers, that though personally, we are sex workers, sex workers are near and dear to our hearts. These are our friends. These are people we care about greatly. I also think that everybody has a stake in this fight, whether they see it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's very powerfully stated and very, I think you hit the nail on the head. And it's something that, I think about a lot, is how to adequately communicate that to people. Like, when the sex industry was my beat, that's sort of how I explained it to people, except not nearly as well as you just did. Like, how we treat sex workers matters to everybody, because the way we treat sex workers arises from slut shaming, and slut shaming affects everybody.
Yeah.
And I struggle to relate that to people, I guess.
Yeah.
I struggle to, I think it has a lot to do with what we were talking about earlier in terms of which voices get elevated and which ones don't. I think that if more people knew sex workers and were familiar with their stories and heard their stories, they'd be more inclined to see how whorephobia is an issue that affects everybody in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But to do that, we really need to make these voices heard.
Yeah.
And that's actually so complicated given how stigmatized sex workers are. The vast majority of people need to conduct sex work in some sort of quiet and not out way. So a lot of people know a lot of sex workers and don't even realize that they have these, side hustles.
And I think that's increasingly true as sex work is being geographically decentralized because of the internet.
Yeah, but that's such a complicated problem, because until we dismantle some of these biases, people aren't going to feel safe coming out. And with people who aren't safe out, there isn't going to be that sort of representation that causes people who are outside of it to change some of their opinions.
Yeah, it's a catch-22.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think.
I was actually thinking about another thing as you were talking, which is that actually this attitude of victim blaming is a little bit schizophrenic when it deals with, when we're talking about sex workers, because on the other hand, you have, particularly coming from feminist movements and like sort of trafficking narratives, this idea that all sex workers are victims and that they don't have any agency, to the extent that even when sex workers who assert their own agency and their own choices aren't taken seriously for having had a choice. But then when they talk about actually being victimized in any substantial way, those things are discounted, not being legitimate because of the choices that they've made. So that's also a catch-22.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really, really, really good point. And actually, you bringing it back to Ron Jeremy a little bit, like the one thing that I saw that, well, a lot of things have made me angry in terms of responses to the article, but the one thing that I saw that like really made me angry was somebody wrote an op-ed about how we shouldn't be surprised by this because the sex industry is inherently a form of slavery and no one is free. And I was like, really, dude? Like, is that really, like, what you take away from this? Like, have your opinions all you want about sex work, fine. But, like, is that really what you take away from the stories of a dozen women?
Right.
Really?
Right. Who are saying, like, I'm in this, but that doesn't mean that I agreed to, him groping me or raping me in the bathroom before a shoot or, all of these other stories that have come out. So you would actually think that the fact that these women are making these assertions about what they are okay with and aren't okay with would undercut the idea that any of them are slaves. I mean, they clearly have their own set of expectations and rules about how they ought to be treated there.
Yeah, and these are expectations and rules that are very clearly established on most mainstream professional film sets.
Right.
I mean, people are extremely rigorous about consent, which is just by necessity, because if your body is your vehicle or your tool as the laborer, you have to be. Like, you have to lay the boundaries right off the bat, which is another reason why these allegations of misconduct were so egregious, because they took place in an industry that is actually, contrary to popular belief, extremely rigorous and, very conscientious in terms of consent issues.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really enlightening to talk to you about your article. Is there anything that you want to talk about?
No, I want to thank you for having me, and I want to thank you for talking to me about this. We are probably going to publish a follow-up story sometime next week, and unfortunately, after it was published, it necessitated a follow-up because a lot of women did come forward to me.
Wow.
Gotcha.
And come forward to other reporters afterwards, which is unfortunate. Thank you guys so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the work that you do.
You're welcome.
Our
It
pleasure.
was great. All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. We want to conclude this special edition of the Peep Show podcast by reflecting on the fact that the experiences that so many women in and around the adult industry describe of being sexually violated cannot be blamed on just one bad apple. Responsibility also belongs to a society that creates conditions for pervasive sexual assault by dismissing women and stigmatizing sex workers. Ron Jeremy isn't exceptional, quite the opposite. He's an aspirational symbol of masculine behavior. It's with these attitudes and behaviors that change must start.
We really enjoyed putting this episode together for you all. We appreciate the time and energy of our lovely guests, Ginger Banks and EJ Dickson. You can find Ginger on Twitter at GingerBanks1 and EJ at EJ Dickson. I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at Sapiotextual.
I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me at Peach Sage.
The podcast itself is also on Twitter at peep_cast. You can tweet us there with questions or comments. We would love to hear from you. We would also like to thank those of you who've been supporting our podcast up until this point. We need your support to keep the podcast running, to pay for our website and the services that host and distribute it. Please consider visiting our Patreon and contributing. You can find us on patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Don't forget, you can also support us by following us on iTunes or SoundCloud and leaving us reviews. Thanks to Joe Kennedy for the music. The show was produced by PJ and Jessie Sage. That's right, I actually did production on this one. Signing off, have a great week.